Earlier this year, you had big dreams and big ambitions. Maybe you had a big, full vision board or a big list of KPIs, and maybe some of these things were there. So you wanted to become the go to expert online, land opportunities for both your business and your podcast, interview industry leaders and dream guests, but also make progress towards your lifelong goals of leaving a legacy. But where are you really? And while we may have big dreams, sometimes it feels like they're too big, and we may not know actually how to get there. Now, you can call it being the Lulu or being unrealistically positive, but I truly believe that every business owner, every leader has the capacity and the opportunity to do all of these things that I just mentioned, become the go-to expert online and make a mark without a big audience. Now, this podcast episode is going to be covering some of the practical ways that you can achieve your dreams even with just a smaller audience, with a smaller audience on your podcast, with a smaller audience on your newsletter and your social media. And I'm going to be sharing things that I've done as a podcast leader, but also how I've helped my clients achieve the same. I'm Anna Xavier. I'm an award-winning podcast marketer. And in this episode about mindset, we're going to talk about the practical ways that we can really trick ourselves into believing that anything has happened, but also how to actually get there. Welcome to the podcast space. Let's dive into this week's episode. All right, so this week I decided to change things up a little bit on the setup. So I'm not 100% sure this is going to work out. I hope it does. I wanted to create a little bit of a different vibe because just for YouTube, I wanted to try something different. And I think that ties in with the first thing, which is really doing the thing. I can't stress enough how important it is that if you have a podcast, if you want to become a leader in your industry, you cannot be bogged down with unreasonable fears or crippling anxiety or analysis paralysis to the point where you're actually not taking action. And what do leaders do? I want to invite you in this episode. Every time I'm mentioning something, really think about the people that you look up to. And, if you were to look online, my presence isn't huge. I don't have 5,000 followers if you add all of my social media followers and my newsletter subscribers, but it is possible to achieve all of the things that I'm going to be talking about that I have done. And I have been able to help clients achieve that because there's a framework for this. And the first step of this framework really is helping yourself get there. And what I mean by this is that it's not questioning yourself every step of the way. And I do this all the time as well. I'm not saying that I am, immune to this, but it starts with actually taking action. And so many podcasters, so many leaders that I start working with, when it is whether like through our coaching or through our podcast power hour, I feel like a lot of people feel like they need to do the right thing, to do the right way. And, there's a lot of experimentation that needs to take place in order for us to succeed because nobody was born taught, as we say it in Portugal. And it's so easy to delay every single step because we think, oh, I'm not ready yet. Oh, I have to wait until I have, an X amount of followers. Oh, I have to wait until my setup is better. So I buy a camera, I buy whatever it is, right? We question ourselves all the time. And not enough of us think about what our future self would do. And this episode really is about honoring our future self goals. And how excited would yourself be, your future self, if you said, hey, this week I'm taking one action apart from publishing the podcast, I'm taking one action toward getting towards those goals. There's these very popular concept, the build in public, right? So if you own a business, if you're testing new things, you're telling people, you're bringing people along the way. And how you're going to make your dreams come true and how you're going to really achieve anything you want is by owning that vulnerability, that experimentation of the process. And so some of the things that I've been able to do since launching the podcast space in 2020, and let me tell you, before launching the podcast space, I didn't really have what can one say a presence. It really, again, it helped because of the pandemic, right? We all had to be online. But I feel like a lot of people are so hung up with the perfectionism and what they see their leaders who maybe have a team of 20. Or maybe they have been doing that for 8 years and they really get stuck in that result and they don't look at themselves and say, hey, I'm actually not there. I can create pretty good content, but I'm not there yet. So some of the things that I feel like podcasters tell me or business owners tell me that they want to achieve are, some of the things that are totally doable. There are a few things that they tell me normally, and you may tell yourself that you want these things for yourself as well. So you may want to collaborate with dream peers, people that you look up to, right? And you want to be featured in magazines. You want to be featured in newsletters. You want your podcast to get recognition from, like Apple Podcasts. Or you may want to start taking stages publicly, right? Like do public speaking. And I've covered many times before on the podcast how to become a thought leader, how to become a public speaker through your show, what skills your podcast teaches you. But this episode is more about the mindset, and some of these things that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to hammering down because all of these things that I've just mentioned, I've achieved them with a team of one. And many of my clients who are a team of 1, 2, or even 3 people, they have achieved these things too. So I feel like a lot of people right now in 2024 look around and say everything feels harder. And yes, everything feels harder and is harder. We are less time online. People are not using as many devices as we used before. So people are busier, so they are more focused on experiences. So a lot of times, even though podcast listenership has increased over the years, we're talking about new audiences, but the people who are listening to podcasts, they have their schedules set, right? So it may be a little harder sometimes to break through the noise, but some of these things that are still doable for everyone, every client that I've worked with, it's still doable in 2024 as it was really in 2020. Now, what we need to think about is really about taking action. And it feels scary to send out an email. The more you do it, the more you will feel comfortable doing it. And there's a fear that I see a lot of podcasters come to me with. They have a lot of fears of rejection. And I always say, what would your future self feel if you sent this email right now and they said, and they gave you an answer? Because I don't believe in no's, I believe in not yet's. And so many times we, by sending out an email that is intentional, we are paving the way for our future self to get to those goals. So instead of thinking that this email is the absolute opportunity to make something happen, I want you to consider this email as the first step toward opening that door. And you will be surprised at how many times, and I can include an episode that I did with my client Hethel, where we covered actually how she got answers from a ton of people that she had been either not getting answers to at all, and opportunities for like sponsorships and things like that for her podcast. And all of these things that, when we're looking at like sending an email, it feels scary, but like if your future self wants sponsorships, you have to get used to sending out emails, right? Like it's the first that is the hardest. And Hethel actually said something funny. She mentioned, the first email took me like 5 hours to write or 3 hours to write. And then the following emails became easier. And she's like, and that's something you said. And I was like, yes. It truly is about the leaders that we see in front of us. They had to send that first email, right? And it's crazy when we don't believe it's possible. And so when we're talking about mindset, really is about looking at everybody else doing the things that we want to do and thinking it's possible for them, therefore it is for me too. But what is important to think about, and this is where I talk to clients all the time, that's why it's important to think about your strengths and your weaknesses, because there's a gazillion different ways to get to the results. But the path is determined by us being able to assess what can work for us and what doesn't. An example of this is when we are, for instance, like if you're someone who loves writing emails, but maybe you don't like filming yourself. Well, maybe someone who has no problem emailing someone with a video of themselves talking directly to the person confidently and inviting them on the podcast. And so, for instance, if you like writing emails, an email that is like very thoughtful and intentional may work better for you. And I feel like entrepreneurship is like the inner work you didn't ask for, because you cannot become a successful business owner if you don't understand your strengths and your weaknesses. And a podcast will basically like just go turbo mode on that, because it's everything at full speed. And when we're looking about when we want to achieve with our dreams, it's about establishing that first step. If you, by the end of 2024, want to have, be mentioned on a newsletter, an industry newsletter, start by making sure that they do take applications, they do accept suggestions. As someone who worked in the digital world, as someone who worked in a radio station, if a guest pitched themselves for the show, I would be totally interested in checking out what they wanted to do. I wasn't going to say, psh, no, whatever. I would be welcoming suggestions. So we have to really understand what our strengths are and how we can bring value to them. So many times when we are looking at our podcast, we're afraid of taking bold action, like submitting our podcast to Apple Podcasts. But that's something that we really want. One thing that I really wanted to get to this year was to be featured on a list that said that, the podcast space, or me, was one of the main accounts to look out for in terms of influence in podcasting. And that actually happened. But why did it happen? Because I have been very visible and very vocal and very proactive in reaching out to the industry and making sure that I am, putting stuff out there. Now, how do we effectively do that? We have to take an active role in all of these goals that we have for our business and for our podcast. If we want to be seen as a leader, we have to act like one. And what I mean by this is that if you want to be featured in stages, we have to stop waiting for someone to land on our inbox with an invite. About 98%, I would say, of the opportunities to speak at conferences are open to the public. You can apply to speak. And so what have you been doing? Have you been sending out applications? Have you been using your podcast as a tool for your visibility online to become a speaker? Are you hiding behind your podcast? How often do you actually promote your show? And a lot of times, I feel like people want to do things as a lone wolf or in their own way. And they don't take the time to really nurture the relationships in their network. And so what I would always say is so many opportunities came to me because peers, and again, I took the time to also send my peers opportunities, but people thought of me as a speaker for an event, or they thought of me as to be a judge, for instance, for the International Women's Podcast Awards. Why? Because I am involved in the community. So if we want to become a leader in our industry and become known, we have to be present where our community is. And you don't have to start your own community. You just have to be part of it. A very important thing that I think business owners forget about is to become visible in our expertise. And I feel like most people fall into these two fields. They are either being online and because they don't know where to start talking about their expertise, they find themselves sharing stuff that has nothing to do with their expertise. So the coffee they had in the morning, or maybe their kids. And there's context for that, but it's hard to be seen as a leader if we're not talking about the expertise we have. And I feel like people overcomplicate this in so many different ways. And so what is something that has happened today? I talk about Gary Vee's document, Don't Create. So if you had a coaching session with someone, talk about your services. That's literally the second thing that most people don't do. They want to be seen as a leader in a specific industry, but they don't talk about the work they develop or the client work they are doing. And so you cannot expect to be seen as, the person to be hired for a whatever problem if you also don't share the social proof, right? What is happening to your client, what struggles they're having, how you're helping them grow. And I am guilty of the second one. I basically talk about all the time how to grow a podcast, how to grow your influence online. And I shy away very frequently from talking about the services and the products that I have, the courses that I have here at the podcast space, the coachings that I offer. If you have just started listening to season 2, you have noticed that I started talking a lot more about the client work that I do because it's intentional. I cannot expect you to hire me as a coach if I don't talk to you about the results that my clients have, if I don't talk about the problems that they have that may be shared on your end, right? So those are things that it's important to mention to our community. Now, when we're talking about being more visible on social media, I really want to remind you that talking about your values and talking about your unique skill set is going to be key to attract or repel the audience that is listening to you, right? Or seeing your content. I normally hear the podcast space. I always talk about ethical and sustainable ways to grow, practical marketing advice, and, values that I hold. So I'm not going to tell you that, you can grow a podcast within 10 days because I know that's clickbaity and won't work. Or if I know that you can only achieve that by paying a ton of Facebook ads or by guesting on a lot of different podcasts. But if you are, a solopreneur or if you are a business owner who has very limited time, that might not work. And so it's super, super key to think about these as elements that we need to incorporate in our marketing and in selling our brand. And so, yes, talk about your values, talk about what is meaningful to you. And in that level, I want to talk about something else, which is there are so many different ways to show up as a leader by doing less complex things. And what I mean by this is instead of creating 5 posts every week, of creating a 20-minute episode, for instance, instead of creating 7 posts where you talk about stuff, you are actually highlighting other people. And I've been able to do some of these things where when my business is very busy. For instance, right now, I am in the process in October of 2024 of moving from Texas to Arkansas. And so what I've been able to do this time is to do less content. And think about this. As a leader, you're thinking long term, right? You're thinking about micro actions that you can take every single day. And the impact you will see is in the long run. But just because you're not creating as much content that week, if you're not writing as many thought pieces, doesn't mean that it is not valuable. And a very quick way to do this is to take things that your peers may have done and share them and add your 2 cents and create a podcast episode where, for instance, a peer did a podcast episode on something and it made you think of something else. So you can quote them and you can highlight their work. And you don't have to always start from ground zero, right? You can take something else that happened. And we can tie that in with current affairs and news. And on last week's episode, I talked about how we are kind of hostage to the news cycle. So if something happens that basically fills the news with something specific, and again, news, podcasts, social media, it may be hard to cut through the noise. So when we are weaving in our expertise through these thing that happened, there's no better way. Again, most of my most popular podcast episodes have been things like talking about listener habits that have been highlighted in a recent study. Or for instance, after podcast conferences, I have so many people on my DMs asking me, hey, when will you do a recap of what happened on the conference, right? I don't need to set up my own conference. I can go to someone else's conference and highlight what was said there. And there's still value, and I'm still showing up as a leader because I am weaving in my expertise in that piece of content. Now, I want to go back into a second because there was something that I did mention that I think is really important. When we are creating content, we feel like everything we create, we have to do it by ourselves. And the way to become a thought leader is to become a thought leader by association. I've been able to be invited to be a speaker at eCamp, Captivate, Riverside. I've been featured on Podcast Movement's newsletter. All of these things happened because I recognized that these bigger brands, that these podcast hosting companies, these conferences, they are brands that are known, liked, and trust. So if I get featured on these platforms, I'm going to be, by association, considered a thought leader, of course, to a bigger, wider community. And so what did I do? I want to invite you, again, your future self. I want to invite you to really start establishing relationships with the people who run these accounts, who are the community managers. That's exactly what I did. Like, I submitted myself as a speaker. I submitted an application or build a relationship with the people who were the decision makers and said, hey, I have this expertise that I know it's valuable for your audience. Would you be interested in doing something like this? And I always talk about this anecdote because sometimes people get so stuck in what they don't have that they don't appreciate what they have. So I did a pitch to ConvertKit, that is now called Kit, is a newsletter provider, is the newsletter that I use. And I actually pitched them for SEO purposes. I wanted to pitch them an article about podcasting, and they ended up saying that they actually were transitioning a lot of the content and they were not doing that. Instead of feeling frustrated that didn't happen, what actually ended up happening was even better. So their team suggested that I would be featured on their Discover Creator section, which is an internal part of Kit where you can search for newsletters to either subscribe to or to recommend. And it's been so cool because actually, a few months ago, my husband's coworker, who actually had an account on ConvertKit, messaged me. He's like, "Oh, hey, Anna, I saw you feature there." And it was so cool to just have that moment be brought to my attention, right? Like, my newsletter is still under 1,000 subscribers at the moment, but it was such a cool thing because I had the courage to say, hey, no, I have an expertise that I think is valuable, and taking the time to be proactive, to show up as a leader and say, hey, company, do you need this kind of expertise? I have it. I would love to collaborate. So not thinking that you have to build your company by yourself or build your influence by yourself. You will become a leader as well by association. And that's the same thing for inviting people on your podcast. And so if we were to encapsulate this podcast episode in one sentence or in one kind of vibe, I would say that I want to, by the end of these episodes, to stop saying things like, I can't do this yet. I'm not big yet. I don't have enough downloads. I don't have enough followers. You can leave a legacy right now. You can be a leader right now. But it is by being diligent and taking courageous action, and that it will all compile into this influence that you want to have. So you cannot tell your future self, sorry, future self, I'm not ready yet. Like, you'll never be ready, right? One day I'll have big influence. One day when I have a huge following, it will make sense for me to do this. Right? Like, again, as I said in the beginning of the episode, I don't even have 5,000 followers and nobody cares. Why? Because I show up in my expertise and owning and ready to collaborate. Now, if I want you to stop being a lone wolf and doing things by yourself, that's number one. I want you to really think about what is the best way to get the impact that you want. And when I say that, I mean, you have to stop telling yourself that you can figure it out. You can Google it. Yes, you can. But what if you were to actually find help? Someone who is qualified, someone who's done that. I have helped coaching clients achieve all of these things through these frameworks, through helping them figure out like how to pitch effectively, how to land those deals, and how to grow their brand in a way that feels sustainable, in a way that feels practical and that is achievable. Because as a business owner, there are a gazillion different things that you can do today, tomorrow, and next week, but only a few ones will actually get you the results you want. And I've done all of these things. I have helped all of these clients achieve that. So why would you wait? Why would you wait until 2025 to see the results that you want? I want to invite you to message me, to visit thepodcastspace.com and to book a call so that you can start growing now and see what the results could be, what your future could look like. It doesn't matter the size of your audience. It matters what you do and how you do it. So everything that I mentioned will be in the show notes of this episode. Remember to share this podcast with a friend. Remember to keep creating content that's imperfect but moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.